everyone, and welcome to Global 360, the webcast produced by the Washington Diplomat, which has been the premier source of information for the diplomatic community here in Washington, D.C. for over 25 years, and also sponsored by Cigna and Sahori Insurance. I'm Anna Gavell. I am the managing editor. And as some of you may know, I've hosted the Ambassador Insider series that we regularly hold over the years. Now, sadly, of course, the coronavirus has put a hold on our live events, but we're fortunate that technology has enabled us to stay connected. And on that note, we are very fortunate today to have a seasoned diplomat with us to talk not only about what everyone is talking about, which is, of course, the pandemic, but also other important developments that are taking place in the world. So, Ambassador Khan, thank you so much for joining us today. Good to see you. I think you might be muted, so we're going to need to unmute you. But in the meantime, I want to give a little bit of background. So Ambassador Khan has been with the Pakistani Foreign Service for 30 years now. And in that time, he's covered a lot of ground from the UN to relations with Iran, Turkey, Central Asia, and the Americas. He was also Pakistan's envoy to Japan before becoming ambassador to the US in January 2019. But he's already well acquainted with Washington, D.C., having served here as Chargé d'Affaires and Deputy Chief of Mission from 2012 to 2015. So we're pleased last year to hear that you are coming back because, as you know, it's nice to see familiar faces in the nomadic world of diplomacy. And in fact, we interviewed the ambassador for a cover profile almost exactly 1 year ago, and we'll be providing a link to that article on this webcast when it's posted to YouTube. And actually, that's where I wanted to start our discussion because a primary focus of that article was the situation in Kashmir, because at the time, India had just revoked the special status that the Indian administered portion of the disputed territory had had since the 1940s. And in many ways, 1 year later, the situation has neither changed nor improved. Now, for those who may not know, I'm going to give a very basic Cliff Notes primer on Kashmir, both which India and Pakistan have laid claim to, and it's located in the Himalayas. Now, the two nuclear-armed neighbors have also even fought several wars over Kashmir ever since the British partition of India and Pakistan. And then in August, of course, of last year, India revoked the autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir in what Prime Minister Modi said was an effort to bring jobs and investment to the impoverished region. But critics said it was a part of a long-standing effort by Hindu nationalists to dilute the region's Muslim-majority population. India also cut off travel and most communications in the territory of roughly 8 million people, and it arrested activists in what it said was an effort to prevent unrest. Now, the move was widely criticized, although there has not been much tangible action by the international community since then to resolve the dispute. And while the mass uprising against Indian rule that some had feared has not materialized, the situation remains highly volatile. So on that note, just last month, anti-India protests and clashes broke out after the killing of a top rebel leader. And very recently, photos emerged of a little boy sitting on the body of his grandfather, a civilian who was reportedly caught in the crossfire between Indian forces and militants, although the family says he was pulled from his car and shot by Indian forces. So, and also on top of all of this, Kashmir still remains essentially under a lockdown, which is all compounded, of course, by the coronavirus pandemic that is spreading very rapidly throughout the region. So this long-standing conflict is still very much an active and combustible one. So, Ambassador, of course, let's go ahead and start right there. And before we begin, I wanted to let everyone know that throughout the discussion, if you have any questions, feel free to log into our Twitter site. Our handle is @DiplomatNews, and go ahead and ask questions, and we will be getting to them at the end of our discussion. So, Ambassador, let's dive straight in here. What can you tell us about the current conditions that are taking place in Kashmir?
First of all, thank you very much, Anna, for arranging this webinar, this conversation. I'm happy to always interact with Washington Diplomat. It was a pleasure, as you mentioned, to have that conversation with you almost a year ago. And I'm also glad that perhaps I am the first ambassador
Yes.
to do this first virtual interaction with Washington Diplomat. So in that way, perhaps we are making history today. Now,
Yes, we're all going digital.
thank you very much. So, and talking about history, I think, and thank you very much also for giving quite a comprehensive account of what Kashmir is about. Uh, I think your audience and listeners must know that Kashmir actually is the oldest unresolved dispute on the agenda of the UN Security Council. It's a internationally recognized disputed territory. It is recognized as such bilaterally between India and Pakistan. Also, it is a disputed territory recognized by United States also. Now, therefore, you know, what happened in August last year was clearly in violation of India's own constitution. It was in violation of the commitments that the Indian leadership had made to the people of Kashmir. It was in breach of our bilateral agreements. And on top of that, it was also in violation of the UN Security Council resolutions and the international law. And you would recall, you know, because last year when we had that conversation, and I think it's important to start our conversation today from that point and recall some of the things that we had said then, because some of those conversations also took place in the backdrop of the Pulwama episode, where India alleged that, you know, that terrorist incident was orchestrated by Pakistan, and they, you know, blamed us within a few hours of that incident happening. And Pakistan maintained that there were no terrorist camps, that they violated our territory, they took out no terrorists, you know, they killed no one, and that this incident was being used for domestic political mileage by the BJP government led by Prime Minister Modi. You know, in hindsight, and that happened around the election time. In hindsight, you can see that every single one of the claims made by India, by the BJP government then, have proven to be wrong. And that's not what we say. This is something which has been independently you know, articulated by neutral observers, by journalists, by international organizations. Now, the thing is that over the last 1 year, unfortunately, starting with this Indian act of annexing the Kashmiri territory, the repression, unfortunately, has worsened. I would say that this is probably the bleakest year in the history of Kashmir, and Kashmiris right now are living through the darkest hour of their history, because if you look at the number of arrests made, you know, they have not just not released those who were arrested post August 5, but they have actually incarcerated more and more people over the years, and the brutality and violence being used to repress Kashmiris, you know, the cordon of so-called operations, disappearances, use of pellet guns, all of that. And this is happening on top of the COVID lockdown. So I think Kashmir is perhaps today the only territory in the world which is suffering, and Kashmiris are suffering from a double lockdown. One is the one triggered after August 5, and then the other one. And I think in this situation, when communities are actually relying a lot on virtual connectivity, the lockdown and the resulting suspension of all internet and web access by the Kashmiris has actually added to their misery. And not just what is happening, just if you look at this last year, since the beginning of this year, around 110 Kashmiris have been killed, and the escalation also on the line of control. In just since January this year, there have been close to around 1,600 violations across the line of control, clearly in breach of the 2003 ceasefire agreement between India and Pakistan. So really, all in all, I would say that situation has worsened. Indian repression has increased, and the fears that we had, we had said that India is doing this to bring about demographic change in Kashmir, and that is precisely what they are doing. They have just given domicile, they changed their domicile laws for Kashmir and have granted 25,000 Indians the domicile for Kashmir, which is again and clearly an attempt to alter the demography of Kashmir. And this is a fear which is in violation of basically India's commitment given to the United Nations. It is a breach of UN Security Council resolution, and it is also a violation of the Fourth Geneva Protocol.
So on that note, Ambassador, that leads into my next question. And when we did speak last year, Prime Minister Khan had just gone to the United Nations to denounce India's moves. And you've talked about the repression continuing over the last year in violation of UN rules. So what has happened since Prime Minister Khan went and warned of the repercussions at the UN? How has the international community addressed the issue, in your opinion? And also, what do you hope it will do in the future to address the issue, given that it has there's not been much progress?
Well, first of all, Pakistan has and will continue to extend political, diplomatic, and moral support to the Kashmiris. And Prime Minister presented their case very forcefully. Unfortunately, so far, international reaction and response has not been commensurate, I would say, with the level of repression that we are seeing in Kashmir, although the OIC, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the European Parliament, all of them have actually issued statements and have issued reports that basically outline the repression in Kashmir. But in terms of political action, in terms of making India undo some of the steps and measures that they have taken, I think there has been, frankly, very limited success. And that's where I would say that international community should neither be misled by India, and the international community should not misread the situation on the ground.
So why do you think that there has been a lack of action? Because obviously on the flip side, India has criticized Pakistan for allegedly arming and training rebels inside Kashmir. So it is a complicated issue. Why do you think the international community has not responded more forcefully to what is well-documented human rights violations? And what are you doing to convince the international community to take more forceful action?
Again, I think, of course, countries have their own reasons in terms of taking positions on issues and disputes, but the fact that at least in the public space, be it the media here in United States, be it the US Congress. The House actually had a special hearing. The Lentos Commission also had a special hearing. The European Parliament also had those dedicated. So we feel that gradually the world opinion is getting to a point where we will have enough political momentum to basically convince or persuade or force India to take those actions. These are still inadequate. I would say that perhaps the international community is preoccupied with perhaps other issues, and that's why it has not resulted in as focused attention as we would expect. But we will continue, because I think what we are convinced that we are on the side of the right when it comes to the situation in Kashmir, that their right of self-determination is protected and guaranteed by the UN Security Council resolutions. We have gone to the UN Security Council. The Prime Minister has written letters to all the heads of state and government of the UN Security Council member states, raising these issues. We have done that, and we will continue to raise, and we are hopeful that it will result in political action, if not now, maybe in near future.
So one final brief question on that. You had mentioned the US, of course, and President Trump had at the time briefly offered to mediate the dispute before he backtracked. And of course, as you said, this is a time where not just we're in a pandemic, but the US is coming up on highly watched, to minimize it, highly watched elections in November. Do you have any hopes or conversations with the administration to, in these final few months, address the issue? And in general, I mean, how are relations at this point with the White House, given everything that's happening and the election coming up?
I would say that we are thankful to President Trump for having taken a consistent interest in the Kashmir issue, interest in the plight of Kashmiris, having repeatedly offered his good offices, to mediate this long outstanding dispute. So far as his intention is concerned, I think people of Pakistan and Kashmiris greatly value and appreciate that gesture. Now, understandably, India has not accepted that offer of mediation. We are still convinced today that if any country that can make a difference and can perhaps convince India and basically inject some rationality into their actions, it is United States of America, and it is the President of United States. United States has in the past volunteered and offered to mediate. Even previous US presidents have also done that. We are hopeful that President Trump, perhaps in the lead up to the elections, I don't know how he will have the political space to basically go out and get himself involved in a complicated issue as Kashmir. But we are hopeful that whosoever is the next president of the United States, given the level of repression that we are seeing and the way in which it poses a threat to peace and security, not just for South Asia, but for the wider region, I think it is important that the US president takes interest as other US presidents have taken in the past.
And now, of course, regardless what happens in November, the US, just like the world, is consumed by the crisis of the pandemic. Unfortunately, we know all too well about this crisis, being the country with the leading number of cases and deaths. But Pakistan and South Asia in general, like many other regions, is deeply affected by the pandemic and struggling to address it. So for our listeners, Pakistan lifted its lockdown on May 9th. Since then, unfortunately, there have been a surge of cases. There have been media reports that hospitals have been overrun, forced to turn people away. And many experts are predicting that the virus could peak over the summer, possibly infecting hundreds of thousands of Pakistanis and many others in the region. So, Ambassador, can you give us kind of an overview of what the status is of the pandemic in Pakistan and what the government is currently doing to contain it?
Well, yes, I think it's a good departure point to move the conversation to our next topic. And I think you're right. The situation clearly has deteriorated in Pakistan since after the lifting of the lockdown. And today, as we speak, we have around 215,000 cases of COVID-19 infections, Now, but if you look at the size of Pakistan's population and the level of population concentration in Pakistan, I would say that the numbers are particularly in terms of rate of infection and also in terms of the casualty rate. The number is still relatively low. Obviously, our health system is fragile and is under a lot of pressure. But I think overall, the capacity of the system has not been exhausted as yet. Perhaps I think those reports that you are alluding to in terms of patients, perhaps that is for some hospitals. There may have been cases where patients were basically asked to go back, but overall in medium-sized cities and towns and even in big cities, in other hospitals, that capacity is still there.
Now, not to interrupt, but what about on that note, concerns that that there isn't enough testing to accurately gauge the number of cases, which is something that many countries are struggling with in terms of testing. I mean, how in that specific area, what is Pakistan doing to ramp up testing to get a very more accurate picture of the disease and how it's spreading?
Anna, for any government, I think COVID-19 is a unique challenge, I think. And each government is learning by doing things, in the sense that there are no other examples to follow. And each country and each city has its own situation and context. So obviously there is one part which relates to the health-related impact of the challenge, and then there is the economic impact of the crisis and the resulting lockdown. So on the health-related side, first of all, prevention was a very important step, and our government was actually quite quick in bringing in the lockdowns, in sealing the borders, in blocking the flights, in testing every single person coming into Pakistan, putting them in quarantine, trying to do the tracking and tracing, and then enhancing the testing capacity. We started off by just about 1,000 tests capacity a day. We have gone up to about 20,000, and we hope to get to 30,000, Being a poor country, obviously our resources are limited, but we are trying to do, and we have also developed indigenous capacity. Now, then there was this ability and capacity to quarantine and to have those facilities where you can treat those. So in some of the cities, they have converted stadiums, they have converted railway bogies into, hospital wards. So that capacity also has been increased. And at the same time, and then for the medical professionals and medical workers, their own personal safety and security was at risk. So procurement of personal protective equipment and also the availability of ventilators. So we went out to get procure whatever we could procure initially from outside and from overseas. Meanwhile, our own indigenous capacity was enhanced and boosted. And today we have developed, they may not be high-end breathing assistance devices, but we have them today in Pakistan. We have our own protective equipment. We have PPEs. We have our own masks, and we are actually now exporting them also. So this has, in a way, so that's the medical part, the prevention part, the mitigation part of it. Labs, there are 110 testing labs, it may still not be enough. But again, I think that the lack of testing capacity is also a little over exaggerated, because once you get to the hospital, those who are infected, they do get, or those who are not well, they do get that testing. So the rate of infection has for instance, in Islamabad, it has gone down actually. So the thing is that, and then on top of that, the casualty rate is also pretty low. But for the government, and I think that's a challenge for any government anywhere, where for a poor country, if I have a family of 5 and I have to bring food for my kids every evening, and for that I have to go and make a living, as a daily wager, so that's the biggest challenge.
Well, that's, and that leads me really to my next question, which is, of course, and by the way, for other questions, again, reminder at Diplomat News for Twitter. But, I think this is such a dilemma that is facing every country almost in the developing world. I mean, the WHO has criticized your government for reopening too soon, and Prime Minister has ruled out the possibility of another lockdown, at least for now. And as I said, this is such a fine line that so many countries are trying to balance, which is that the lockdown itself might be deadlier than the actual disease, because, as you said, families need to eat, and there's so many people working in the informal economy. So what is the government doing to try and balance this fine line of keeping people socially distanced, keeping them as much as possible at home, while also mitigating the financial impact, especially when it comes to the poorer sections of society?
Exactly. I think that is the biggest challenge for any government, and more so for governments in poor countries, and that's the balance that we have tried to, or we are trying to strike, So what we have done is that while we have relaxed the lockdown in a phased manner, we have basically moved to the smart lockdown or selective lockdown, where the National Coordination Committee has identified 20 cities, and within those cities, they have also identified hotspots, where and those hotspots are being then quarantined from the rest of the community. So that enables those communities, to basically be separated from, while at the same time government is also investing a lot in terms of educating people, and also in making sure that the standard operating procedures and guidelines are followed by the community. So it's a combination of education, helpline establishment, and then at the same time, these selected focused hotspots being quarantined from the rest of the community. And that has actually, frankly, resulted in producing at least good results, although the jury is still out in terms of good empirical data. But the fact of the matter is that this has allowed us to open those sectors which were less vulnerable to COVID. Uh, uh, Sectors where you could go in and work and earn yourself living, perhaps construction sector and others,
Mhm.
and so that has alleviated the pain that the economic suffering that these poor people, vulnerable people were going through. Now that's one part of it, but even before going there, I think what the government did was this historic stimulus package, 1.2 trillion rupees, I mean, by Pakistani standards, $8 billion to be pumped into the economy, by way of supporting the vulnerable population, by way of direct cash transfers, by way of subsidizing the groceries and the daily household use items, for the poorest of the poor in the society. And then also injecting money for wheat procurement and some of the other essential food items, all of that and that's why actually Prime Minister was very vocal and active in advocating a global debt relief initiative, because he was convinced, and we believe that, for countries to be able to effectively deal with this challenge, they will have to have that fiscal space.
Mhm.
And that fiscal space would come through some of the debt relief initiatives.
Yeah. Well, so on that note, if you could elaborate, kind of a twofold question. And again, this is very universal to so many developing nations. I mean, you have wealthy, I mean, the global economic shocks of the pandemic are going to impact almost every single nation. And you have wealthy nations like the US, obviously struggling themselves to handle this pandemic. So, let alone poorer nations. And so, this is not going to be a typical crisis where, the developing world can naturally expect a certain amount of assistance from the international community. So, two questions. What would you say to wealthier countries who will say we need to focus at the moment on our own economic stimulus packages, on ensuring protecting our own populations, and then also looking down the line, in theory, hopefully a vaccine will be developed at some point. Are you concerned, as many governments are, that the development of vaccine could become a free-for-all that leaves developing nations who aren't involved in it out and in last place to try and get a vaccine? So what would you kind of tell the international community in terms of paying attention to developing nations in trying to combat this pandemic?
I think that's absolutely critical, because we are all in it together. And as we have seen, the infection next door is my infection. If it was next door yesterday, it will be mine tomorrow. So you cannot keep countries in isolation while only protecting yourself. So I think the international community and world should come together like never before, because I don't think that we have experienced a pandemic like this at the scale like this ever before. And we will not be able to come out of it, whether medically or financially, unless and until the whole international community come together and extend support and helping hand to each other. I mean, there are ways in which countries, and obviously the vaccine development, or the companies will invest in developing those vaccines. But right now, it is the public funds that are being hugely invested into development of those vaccines, and therefore those countries and the public sectors in those countries will have a principal and primary right in having access to those medicines. And that's where, I think the poor countries would come in. So it's not about making profit, but it's about protecting the humanity. And that the best way to go about doing it is to come together. And similarly, like the debt payments. I mean, for instance, Pakistan had to resort to or request for IMF support by availing the rapid finance facility. So they came and they made available around $1.4 billion, which helped us fiscally, financially. And then we also requested for debt deferment that also left more liquidity at our disposal. Similarly, from bilateral channels also, we have received assistance in terms of capacity building support, in terms of equipment, in terms of so many other things, So all of this, if Pakistan is enabled, we will basically promote a safer neighborhood. And if a safer neighborhood is promoted, we are basically promoting a safer region and the safer world. So I think in this, we are all together. And there is absolutely no other alternative but to work together.
Yeah. Well, we're certainly realizing that also in this country that, viruses and pandemics know no borders, unfortunately. So, and as you said, all in this together, and on a much smaller scale here in Washington, D.C., we are all being impacted. We are all adjusting, as we can see here virtually. It's, the dawn in a sense of a new age, what our new normal will be. None of us really know what it will look like. I'm still adjusting to Zoom, as everybody is. So, on that note, I've heard locally from a lot of ambassadors and diplomats this new concept of Zoom diplomacy. And, and obviously diplomacy, so much of your job and many of our jobs is built on personal face-to-face interaction. So, Ambassador, can you talk a little bit about what it has been like just for you as an ambassador, really teleworking and not having the traditional face-to-face tools at your disposal? And, how is the embassy here in DC in general handling that?
Well, first of all, I must say, I think as in every challenge, there is also an opportunity. And I think the COVID crisis has helped us discover the immense potential of teleworking, tele-learning, tele-everything. Really, I mean,
that's a new phrase I'm going to use. Tele-everything. I like that.
And obviously, we in diplomacy, the personal interactions and friendships and that matters a lot. But at the same time, in fact, I was talking to one of your colleagues just a while ago, that I'm telling my colleagues that perhaps the new generation will be traveling far less than my generation did in terms of scaling the globe to attend various international conferences, because every day we spend 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, depending on the day, on teleconferencing with colleagues in Islamabad, with colleagues elsewhere, across the United States also. We have discovered this as a tool to connect with our consul generals, we have discovered this as a tool to connect with our community here. So this is going to be the new normal, as you said. Obviously, this is, and the more we do it, more we are going to basically expand its application to areas that we always thought were not worthy of teleworking, So this is something which is, I would say, still in the works. But I feel that the post-corona world is never going to be the same in many ways.
Yeah, it'll be interesting what handshakes and other greetings we eventually come up with. And so speaking of our new digital world, so I want to go try to figure it out. Honestly, now I have so many it's become ridiculous. But one of the last questions we received is a development So we had in Pakistan saw gunmen storm the stock exchange in Karachi, although security officials were able to largely stop the attack. Separatist militant group has claimed responsibility for the attack. Do you have any latest information on the investigation into that attack that happened?
First of all, this was an attack for which the BLA has claimed responsibility. And BLA is a designated terrorist entity here in the United States. It is a designated terrorist entity in UK. And it is very, and this is the second time actually that they have basically resorted to this terrorist activity at this level and scale. Luckily and fortunately, you know, our security forces acted promptly. And they thought it, because if you look at the amount of ammunition they were carrying, the amount of explosives that they were carrying, some of the stuff, other stuff that they were carrying, they were clearly planning to hold up for days actually. And they clearly had a massive, you know, destruction in mind. Their BLA's connection, unfortunately, with India is also well known. And our Prime Minister has already spoken about our suspicions of the Indian connection. This is still an ongoing investigation. And we will have more evidence, and we are looking into that. But I can tell you that this is time actually for the international community to see the external linkages of the terrorism, the suffering that we have experienced in Pakistan over the years. And we have been saying this again and again, and we certainly thank the UN Security Council for issuing that a statement condemning the attack. And we also welcome some of the other statements, including by the National Security Council and the State Department condemning the attack. I think that's what the international community should. And we must go after those who sponsor these terrorists, you know, who finance these terrorists, who provide them with all the weapons that they use. And Pakistan will try to have as transparent an investigation and share the findings with the international community. But it is really incumbent upon the international community to basically identify and put pressure on those who are the sponsors of these active actions.
Mm-hmm. So we have one other question, and I think this is a great question because it applies to many other countries. So U.S. aid to Pakistan has been on the declining, and obviously U.S. foreign aid in general, there have been a lot of attempts by the administration to cut foreign aid. So are there any things that in particular you are trying to work with the U.S. government to secure more U.S. aid for Pakistan?
You know, when Prime Minister has had 3 summit meetings with President Trump, and he was here on an official visit in July also, where he had extensive consultations with different parts of the US government. And in all these conversations, frankly, assistance or aid was not a topic for discussion. Pakistan and in particular Prime Minister believes that we are more keen to expand and have a robust trade and investment relationship than an aid and assistance relationship. While we of course appreciate, I think United States has been kind and generous, particularly I must say in the context of COVID, where US has actually designated Pakistan as one of the 10 priority countries and has already pledged around $21 million of assistance in terms of various kinds of support, capacity building support, testing support, building up lab support and other support, which we greatly appreciate. But again, as we speak, Adam Buller, who is the CEO of the Development Finance Corporation of United States, the new one, which is successor to OPIC, he was in Islamabad yesterday to discuss, and then Secretary Commerce was also in Islamabad in February. President himself has said that he would like to see trade and investment relationship expand by 20 times, and that's a very welcome statement and intention, which is completely reciprocated by Pakistan. And we are very keen. And I tell you, there is tremendous potential. Tremendous. I mean, United States already is one of our largest export destinations. And we also have this potential for importing more from United States. So we are looking at a win-win scenario where both countries' corporate sector makes the best use of opportunities. And Pakistan is a huge market. I mean, we are the 6th largest country with a large middle class, which is strategically connected with a region which is both rich in oil and also in human resource. And we are ready, and US companies, Cargill has gone back, Accelerate is in Pakistan, Exxon Mobil has gone, and on top of PepsiCo, Coke, and many others, who are already in Pakistan.
The joys of this brave new world is my phone, my actual, I'm one of the few people that still has a landline.
Do you?
As we're talking about it, I'm thinking of everything adjusting to this new world, and we can certainly hope that I think Pakistan, the US, and the whole world hopes that it's trade and investment that will ramp up again sooner rather than later in light of the crisis that we are all going through. And on a smaller scale, I hope we're able to see each other in person sooner rather than later, because it helped us function, but it's not quite the same as the in-person meetings. So hopefully that can resume at some point. And I want to thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank your embassy for all of the help that you did in working with us and for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Anna, for organizing this. And of course, I look forward to our personal interactions and definitely organize something face-to-face as soon as we can.
Yeah. And in the meantime, we'll continue virtually connecting, and we will have this webcast up on our Facebook site, on our Twitter, on the embassies, all of the fun digital mediums. We will have this available, and of course we want to send a thank you to our sponsors, Cigna and Sahori Insurance. And we, of course, want to thank all of the listeners viewers that have, viewers both, that have joined us today. Please stay tuned. We will have more coverage of all the important topics happening in the world. And again, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Ambassador, for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.